This is the Triratna Dharma training course for Mitras. If you haven't already viewed the introductory orientation session with the reference 1.1.0, please do. This is a non-professional recording fitted into my week as and when I'm able, so apologies for background noise. A PDF of the material can be found on freebuddhistaudio.com under the community section, and a hard copy is available on lulu.com. This project requires people to interact with the material and to ask questions in the comments. Once 5 questions have been asked, I will answer them in a separate video. It's helpful to me that you ask questions, as then I know that what I'm doing is enjoyed and being engaged with and of value, which is kind of why I'm doing it. Section 1.1.1, Questions and Answers. First question, what does invoking the wordless mean? So a short answer would be that it means enlightenment, but a somewhat fuller answer, I suppose, would be we have lots of words for enlightenment: insight, knowledge and vision of things as they really are, Bodhi, and umpteen different names for the Buddha. It had lots and lots of different titles. The wordless is a very particular way of saying enlightenment. I think all of the different terms for it put a different angle on it. It's a multifaceted ideal or a multifaceted state of mind. And the wordless points to the matter that in Buddhism there isn't any dogma. In Buddhism you can't say the truth in words. You can't have a text like the Bible, which could be considered as, you know, the last word on anything. But that doesn't mean that there is no conception of truth. But truth, from a Buddhist point of view or from the Buddha's point of view, is the experience of living without bias or ignorance. That's where you stop being affronted or disappointed that the universe is the way it is and behaves in the way it does. And you start orientating your life in such a way that sort of moves in time with how things are and not in resistance to how things really are. So knowing the truth in a factual sense from a Buddhist point of view is completely useless. Living in accordance with it is what makes the difference, is what meets the Buddha's mandate, and the Buddha's mandate is not to know everything or know facts or to have particular knowledge, it's to alleviate suffering. Sangharakshita, one of his quotes is that the spiritual life is that of finding emotional equivalents for our intellectual understanding. And a canonical reference to this is the Buddha was approached by a woman whose son had died, and it's not really made clear in the sutta, but at that time, particularly for this woman, having a child and particularly having a son was the key to her future, possibly future survival, or certainly future prosperity. And she had a son, and the son died, and it was just a baby. And she heard that the Buddha was, you know, a mystic of some kind, and she went to the Buddha and said, "Can you please bring my baby back from the dead?" If the Buddha was going to present her with a factual truth, he would have said, "All things are impermanent. Everybody dies. You've gone crazy. Deal with it." And I mean, all those things are factually, I mean, you sort of couldn't argue with them. But like I say, the Buddha's mandate isn't to convey the factual truth of something. It's to skillfully change consciousness to a way that engages in a harmonious way with reality. So what he did instead, he didn't say, "I can't bring your baby back from the dead," nor did he say, "I can." What he said is, "I can help you, but I need a mustard seed. And so she said, okay, and she started walking down to the nearest village, and he said, hang on, no, I need a mustard seed from a house where nobody has died. So she said, okay, and she ran down to the next, to the village, with an idea that, well, with a very particular idea of what help meant, I think. But she went to each house, asked for a mustard seed, and everybody had mustard seeds. But then she said, oh, hang on, has anybody died in this house? And house after house, the people there said, yes, my sister has died. Yes, my father died. Yes, my child died. Whatever it happened to be. And through doing that, she was faced with tens, possibly hundreds of people who, however brief, were recalling grief and loss and having the truth reflected to her in a way that was far more effective to her than everybody dies, get on with it. Those words would not have imparted a change in her consciousness to bring her closer to the reality of things. All things are impermanent, as a philosophical statement, is pretty true, but as a method of transformation, it's generally not very good, actually. And so she, after that, she buried a child and went to the Buddha and said, teach me. So from a Buddhist point of view, the truth is knowing the simplicity of the current moment, knowing that a sensation is a sensation, knowing that a thought is a thought, knowing pleasure and knowing pain for what they are, knowing a volition. And so from a Buddhist point of view, truth is kind of as simple as a piece of string. It's just a piece of string, it's laid out on the table. It's nice and easy. The difficulty is that you, during your life, and however many of your ancestors for tens of thousands of years of and evolution has put you in a situation where that simple piece of string is extremely knotted up, and so you might have to do a lot of complex things to undo that complex knot that you're in, to bring it back to something of simplicity. And so enlightenment is a profoundly simple and uncomplicated state of mind once you're in it, but it's actually not that easy to get into while you're not. It needs quite a bit of effort, quite a bit of training. So this accepting of life being the goal of Buddhism, and it being a simple engagement and acceptance of the moment that you find yourself in, there's a little caveat with that. That doesn't mean that you're a pushover. The reality of your situation is what you sense and is your perception of the world around you. But accepting life is also accepting that you have responsibility and that you have agency in a large enough sphere of that world. So it's not just that you sit down and you let whatever mental state arise or whatever person arise and the mental state or the person molest you in any way that they wish to, and you just sit there and let it happen. That's not accepting life. That's accepting a given experience, but that's not accepting your agency. Your life includes potency and compassion just as much as it includes a given experience, let's say. That state, that's all a sort of precursor to it, but that state is wordless. So all of this is a precursor to the main point, in that the words, all things are impermanent, for example, are not the truth in Buddhism. They're a set of words which may or may not lead your mind to a deeper engagement with reality. So the goal is wordless. It's not about learning lists. However, at the same time, Buddhism is essentially just a list of words and ideas are extremely important. They're not the ultimate goal of Buddhism, but they are extremely important. So it's a little bit like if you're going to build this new mind, a little bit like a house, you can't just build it. You can't just make it from nothing. First of all, you put up scaffolding, kind of in the shape of the house, which are like the words. That's like the practices. That's like the concepts. That's things like the words. All things are impermanent. That's the scaffolding that you put up, and then within that framework, you then put the bricks down of a structure, and you using the framework, you construct something within that framework of value. But as soon as you've constructed it, you then just get rid of the scaffolding. You don't need the scaffolding anymore. And so you could say that the scaffolding has no value because it's ultimately worthless, it's ultimately thrown away. But you could also say that the scaffolding has incredible value because there's no way that you could build the thing in the middle without it. So yeah, the text is pointing to that relationship that if you just go straight to the wordless, if you say, right, I'm just going to build a house with no structure at all, you're not going to get very far. You can't go straight to the wordless. You can't just magically build a house without any form of assistance. First comes the words, first comes the concepts, first comes the theoretical, and then comes the sort of practical doing of it, and then later comes the ultimate aim of what you're trying to do. So question 2. The text refers to our highest self. I thought that Buddhism was trying to get away from the self. Yeah, this is quite confusing, I suppose. The Course and the Dharma in general is not just a science, it's an art as well. And at times a text will be talking about precise terms, sort of more philosophical terms, let's say, or more terms that are uncompromisingly trying to describe reality. So the Abhidharma, which is kind of like Buddhist philosophy or early Buddhist philosophy and psychology, is very clear on this. The terms are extremely precise and very well defined. But that's not the whole of Buddhism, and Buddhism is also an art. Discerning what is poetry in a text and what is clarity, or intellectual clarity, let's say, what is speaking to the heart and to motivation and that side of things, and what is speaking to clarity of vision is a different thing. I would say that the highest self, that term, I would say that's more on the poetic side. So intuitively that brings about, for me, this is me speaking personally, a sense of growth, a sense of potential in myself, a sense of agency and positivity. There's also another aspect in this, in that 2,500 years ago when the Buddha taught, it was in quite an eternalistic culture, and the way that he expressed, we didn't really say a lot about enlightenment, to be honest. 99% of what he said was about method. But what he did say about enlightenment, he was very careful not to say what it was, because as soon as you say what something is in words, the person you're talking to is only going to interpret it in the context of their own previous experience. And if you're interpreting it in your own previous experience, particularly about enlightenment, which by definition is beyond your current experience, you're going to pick up a poor interpretation. You're going to misinterpret what's said. So far as I understand, the Pali language lends itself to this, and the way that the Buddha taught lended itself to this, is that he often described enlightenment in terms of what it wasn't. So the absence of greed, the absence of hatred, the absence of ignorance, the cessation of desire. Nirvana means blowing out, like blowing out of a candle. So this is a little bit like when we say the word fearless. Fearless is a positive characteristic because we've sort of brought that word into our understanding as something very positive. But it's the absence of fear. Now, you kind of know that someone who's fearless is courageous. That's obvious to you. And you can intuit it as a positive word. But when we hear the absence of greed, the absence of hatred, and so on, it can seem to us like enlightenment is just getting rid of things. It's all the parts of you. All you have to do is remove loads of stuff, and what will be left is sort of like an empty, vacuous greyness. Now, that's partly to do with the Pali language, partly to do with how he taught, and also partly to do with modern day culture is quite nihilistic. We can easily fall into that kind of attitude. One of the things that modern schools, particularly Triratna, has brought in is teasing out of the Pali Canon, teasing out of the historical stories, the positive expressions, because at times in the Pali Canon he doesn't say an absence of hatred, he says a presence of love. He doesn't say an absence of ignorance, he says the fullness of wisdom. He doesn't say the absence of desire, he says the fullness of generosity. It's much more necessary in modern life to bring out the positives. Another concern about modern Buddhism is that one can use the language, the incorrectly interpreted language of the Buddha as a way of just getting away from yourself. You can use the ideal of Buddhism just to confirm one's already existing nihilistic tendencies, is that all my problems would be gone if I didn't exist. And certainly from a Buddhist point of view, that's really dangerous because it's just not a useful way of relating. One other thing about using terms like the highest self or the authentic self or your true self, if not taken literally, they can be useful insofar as engaging with Buddhist practice from a weak or sickly or self-flagellating sense of identity or sense of self, where you don't think you're worthy or you think you're fundamentally wrong or sinful or something like that, it can be problematic. Because you're coming to a religion which is, or a way of life which is encouraging the dissolution of your sense of self. And that can be quite appealing because you're just trying to get rid of who you are. But that in a way is taking the ideal of Buddhism upside down. That's a pretty harmful way of engaging with Buddhism. I'd say the antidote to that is that you need to approach Buddhist practice from a strong position. You need to get a capable sense of self first, like quite strong, quite confident, a sense of self that's capable and adaptable and flexible, one that when it notices any inconsistencies or ethical issues doesn't just spin off into self-hatred. You need to have a strong enough sense of self so that when somebody might say, hey, you've done this and this wasn't great, that you actually go, oh, okay, tell me more about that. I'm actually interested in what the consequences of my actions are. You don't retreat into your bedroom for the next 6 months hating yourself. That's not an ideal way to practice ethics. It's also not a great place to practice meditation from, because if you're locked in if you're sat there with your eyes closed and you're locked in that space with an identity that's undermining you continually, meditation is probably not going to be particularly effective. So I'd say for the first 20 or 30 years of practice, the majority of the time I'd say you're trying to build up a sense of identity. You're trying to build up a sense of self into a more mature sense of self. At that point, you can then start to really engage. Well, not at that point, but engaging with the sort of teachings of no self become more effective. I think that's probably the best way I can describe it, really. Yeah. Question number 3. The text says that Sangharakshita experienced insight as a result of exposure to the Diamond Sutra. Is the view of the order that Sangharakshita was enlightened? Do I have to believe that? So first of all, you don't actually need to believe anything to practice Buddhism. Even things like all things are impermanent. I think certain views like that make practicing it a lot easier. But I have to admit that I'm not fully behind that view myself. In a sense, I am a Buddhist because I don't fully believe that. I do believe that all things are impermanent to a degree, but I'm a Buddhist because I think that if I believed that more and put more weight on that and more confidence in that and acted as if that were true, things would go better for me. And so I don't think it's necessarily a sense of you either believe a thing or you don't. I think it's more along the lines of how much confidence do you have in a particular formulation. The structure of Buddhism is such that hopefully an effective practice will mean that you often engage with such views as all things are impermanent, all things are unsatisfactory, and so on. And you're trying to prove whether they're true or false. You're trying to look in your experience, and whatever comes of that is what comes of that. So a bit further than that, to be a Mitra, I would say that you need to have confidence in the movement as a means of facilitating and educating you in Buddhism. I think that's pretty essential. I think it would be difficult to be part of a community that you didn't have confidence was based on sound principles. And more so as an order member, I think, to make a further commitment, I think you would need to be confident in the system of practice. And that does lead to the fact that Sangharakshita compiled the system of practice, not sort of entirely by himself, I'd say, but he is the architect of the movement. And I think individuals' relationship to him as a person is significant. And I don't think you need to think that he is enlightened. But I think if you thought that he wasn't any more developed than yourself, I think it would be difficult to engage with the teachings in any serious way. So what you personally believe the spiritual attainment of Sangharakshita to be is entirely your call. In terms of the way that the question is phrased, what is the view of the order? I don't think the order has a view on. I don't think there is a. There's not a stock order. There's not a standard order member. I think you could say things like I think there are very fundamental Buddhist views, like all things are impermanent. We say, what is the position of the order on whether all things are impermanent or not? It would be yes, all things are impermanent. In terms of the particularities of particular people, who they are, what they do, that is much more nuanced. It's certainly presented in that way in the text. And from a personal point of view, so this is me speaking personally, I would say I'm probably not really qualified to know. I'm pretty confident that his practice and training was more effective than my own, and he was clearly more committed than I was and practiced for a longer period of time. And he's come up with some things that I find very useful and have changed my life quite significantly. I keep going back to his writings, or his lectures particularly, and I keep finding more in them. And so I think that he's probably more developed than I am able to perceive at the moment through lectures, because that's largely how I have ever interacted with him. I did meet him a few times. Really what I'm most interested in is, does the material he present to me have relevance to my life, and is it useful to me? And that I can say yes, and that is actually all I need for the time being. If that ever becomes not the case, then obviously I'll rethink. When the text speaks of a higher world, I'm uncomfortable with the word higher, because if some minds are higher, then others must be lower. And who gets to decide who's who? Isn't it arrogant or pejorative or even dangerous to think this? So I think this is a valid concern. In a lot of instances of history, when certain people or groups of people have considered other people lower, very unethical things have happened. And I think it's right to be concerned and to guard against that. That said, I think also to equate all minds and all opinions as equally valid, no matter what the circumstances, I think is also equally dangerous. If you have a janitor or a brain surgeon, who are you going to take advice off? The obvious answer is on what? If you're going to ask where is the vacuum kept, you want to ask the janitor. And if you have a brain tumour, you need to consult with the surgeon. You don't want to swap their jobs around. Their effort and their time in developing particular skills plays out in their life, and we would trust one in one area and we'd trust another in another area. To misplace that trust could be catastrophic. And the reason that we trust some people and we don't trust other people is because we can see that there are differences in people. And that's really important. Just to consider everybody the same, no matter what they do, and treat your closest friend just like somebody who you meet on the subway, it's not going to be very useful. We relate differently to people based on what we know of them, based on their skills, based on their character, based on our relationship to them. We have different ways of relating. So with those two things in mind, so I think a useful way of relating to this is the power mode or the love mode, which we'll do later in the course. But the hierarchy of power is where the people who are highest are the people who are physically strongest or socially most capable, or they actually have the power to keep other people in less power or less potency. And in that situation, I'd say that the majority of the time that ends up very, very badly. That escalates and can go pretty badly. There's another hierarchy, which is one of maturity. let's say. So a hierarchy of love, a hierarchy of awareness, a hierarchy of responsibility and perspective. And like a really obvious one of this is a parent and a child. So in that situation, the parent in most faculties has more capability than the child, has more capacity and more perspective than the child. Not in all situations, of course, but generally speaking. And the relationship is not one of servitude on the child's part, unless that's a pretty tyrannical parent-child relationship. The child is not a slave to the parent and is not subjugated by the parent. The parent often is serving the child, actually, with their higher mind, with their more capable mind and bigger perspective. They're cooking the child dinner, they're wiping its arse, they're doing all sorts of things that they would rather not do. And so when you look at it in that way, the higher mind is just in service to this less developed mind. Now, if a teacher, if a person that you respect or a person that you think is more mature than you acts in that way, genuinely in your interests, I would say that there's a relatively good chance that they have a degree of development, and that to acknowledge that in them is probably a good thing, and it's probably not a harmful thing. I think if a teacher is lording it over you and telling you what to do and forcing you to make them cups of tea or whatever it happens to be, I think you've got a problem. Particularly this comes out in disagreement. If it's a power mode and you're in disagreement with the person, there'll be domination present, you'll be dismissed or ignored, there'll be gaslighting or coercion in some way. Whereas, if they have a higher mind in the spiritual sense and you have a disagreement with them, they will be trying to resolve it with love, with understanding. They'll be trying to empathise with you, there'll be a degree of respect, and they'll be offering a space for both you and them. So I think in many ways, I often find disagreement very, very useful. There was a talk some time ago where there was, I'm going to try and not involve names in this, but there was somebody who was a public preceptor, very well known, and they were giving a talk to a load of order members. I happened to be there for random reasons. This was when I was sort of first turned up, and they were saying, I think this needs to be done, and that, and how about we develop this, and sort of presenting a vision for the future. And it was quite a strong, impassioned vision for a particular institution in the movement. And there was a young guy who wasn't scheduled to talk. He was just there to listen, but he put his hand up and said, actually, I don't think that that's a good idea because of this and this and this, and if that happens, and he sort of presented a fairly concise but incisive counterpoint. And this was a new upstart young order member. The other guy was well established, and people expected big things from him, who was giving this talk. And I was absolutely shocked that, surrounded by lots of people who really probably put this guy on a pedestal to some degree, the guy who was giving the talk stopped and he thought about it. And he thought about it for about a minute, which is a long time to do when you're kind of on stage giving a talk. He just shut up for a while. He thought about it, and he bowed to this guy and said, "Could you please talk more about it?" Which I thought was quite incredible. So this guy at the front, in most situations, would have been highly invested in this, and highly invested in his identity, and highly invested in what he'd got to say and having his way. And actually somebody just come in and pointed out a different perspective that had truth to it, and he just completely let that happen and didn't hold on to his position, didn't hold on to his view, didn't hold on to the limelight that he had and the attention that he had around people, and let that happen. And that gave me, well, it shocked me actually. I didn't really understand what the hell was going on, but it gave me a lot of respect and a lot of trust for the guy who was at the front, and it gave me a lot of confidence that the movement brings about mature people. So that's all the questions for this week. That was for 1.1.1. I've got these questions from my study group and also from a couple of emails. What would be really helpful for subsequent weeks is if you can post questions on the YouTube comments section. Responding to questions is much, much more intuitive for me. I find it a lot easier. It's a lot more creative. I mean, I can do the reading out of the text. That's no problem. But if it's just that, then actually you may as well just read it yourself. But yeah, please listen or read 1.1.2. I'll put the transcription and the audio up later today.